Some say future wars will be defined by artificial intelligence.
Whichever nation harnesses AI first will have a decisive advantage on the battlefield for many, many years.
And China may be edging closer to gaining the upper hand.
If we don't take a stand now and take action, we have no fighting chance in succeeding 10 to 15 years from now.
So how far has China gotten in developing its AI? Why are they advancing so fast? What could losing the AI race with China really mean for the US and the free world? And what is the Chinese Communist Party's ultimate goal? We explore these questions and more in our latest special report. Hello and welcome to China in Focus. I'm Evelyn Lee in for Tiffany today. There is a new round of competition on the global stage, and this time it's human versus machine. It goes back to 2017 when Google subsidiary DeepMind developed a new piece of artificial intelligence called AlphaGo. The software was able to defeat Ke Jie, the world's #1 player for the strategy game Go.
But it's so calm. It doesn't give you any hope of winning. It doesn't give you any hope at all.
Go is also known as Weiqi. It's a two-player board game that's been called both simpler and more complex than chess. The goal? To claim more territory on the board than your opponent. 2 years after AlphaGo's victory, Google announced in 2019 that its latest AI project doesn't need human help anymore to learn how to beat human players. Instead, it can learn simply by playing itself over and over. The race human versus AI has also extended to the military. Earlier this year, Chinese state media cheered when an AI system took on one of the Chinese military's top fighter pilots in a simulated dogfight and won. Those media outlets touted it as a milestone for the Chinese regime's military modernization. The US recently held a similar experiment.
Potentially with better AI.
Nicholas Chalin is the former chief software officer for the US Air Force. He resigned from the post in September.
Recently, we have a challenge with DARPA, which is the Defense Research Lab, where we demonstrated that we could have a dogfight, right? So two jet fighters fighting together and have one of the jets completely flown by AI and the other by the best Air Force pilot. And every single time the human lost. And that's, I would argue, is not even the most advanced AI capability that there is on the planet.
That's why some believe this technology might decide the fate of future competition and armed conflicts.
Advances in AI have the potential to change the character of warfare for generations to come. Whichever nation harnesses AI first will have a decisive advantage on the battlefield for many, many years.
Again, we're in a race. We have to get to the end state quicker than the Chinese can.
The UK spy chief issued similar warnings. He said artificial intelligence could play an important role over the next few decades. According to him, one of the biggest threats comes from China.
The Chinese intelligence services are highly capable and continue to conduct large-scale espionage operations against the UK and our allies.
And reports by think tanks and the US Defense Department show the communist regime has been using it to develop advanced weapons, technology that in some cases specifically targets US vulnerabilities. But exactly how far has China gone down the rabbit hole of AI development? And what does losing an AI race with Beijing mean for the US and the free world? We explore these questions and more in the special report. To mark the opening of the Innovation Fair Expo 2020 Dubai, China is pulling out all the stops. Hosted by Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, the event began in October and is slated to run till March. But as participating countries vie for attention, Beijing is showcasing a special robot panda. Even more impressive, it's practicing the Chinese martial art form Tai Chi Chuan, or better known as shadow boxing.
The theme of China Pavilion is build a community with a shared future for mankind, innovation and opportunity.
Beijing has previously voiced an ambitious AI goal to become the world leader in developing artificial intelligence by 2030. And the regime has already laid out plans to get there. Chinese Communist Party, or CCP leader Xi Jinping has personally declared that China must ensure that the country marches in the front ranks when it comes to theoretical research in this important area of AI and occupies the high ground in critical and core AI technologies. But China's ambitions aren't just about creating harmless dancing pandas. The regime has made it clear that it will put the technology to military use.
The Chinese People's Liberation Army is moving aggressively to deploy them across many warfighting domains. In addition to developing conventional systems, for example, Beijing is investing in low-cost, long-range, autonomous and unmanned submarines, which it believes can be a cost-effective counter to American naval power.
A recent report by Georgetown University combed through open source documents containing tens of thousands of China's military contracts. According to the report's author, it found that many of Beijing's AI projects explicitly focused on degrading and countering systems at the heart of the U.S.'s military strategy. The Chinese military, also known as the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, now spends the same amount of money funding AI as the U.S., but employs much more help from its private sector. That's thanks to its so-called military-civil fusion policy.
So what it really means is that the government can pick and choose at will what applications, what technologies are being developed in the private sphere and decide to take those on for itself without having to ask permission. Permission is granted simply by being a Chinese company. And that basic principle, I mean, here in the United States, in a time of war, we would probably invoke a similar principle. In a national emergency, in China's case, this covers all types of technologies at all times.
The report also discovered that most of the PLA's AI equipment suppliers are not state-owned defense enterprises, but private Chinese tech companies founded after 2010. What's more, it shows how Chinese progress in military AI is being driven in part by access to American technology and capital. U.S. companies have been supplying China with data, software, and funding. This points to serious shortcomings in the U.S. export control system. Former Chief Software Officer for the U.S. Air Force Nicholas Chalin shed some light on the issue in a recent interview with the Epoch Times. He said the United States is set to lose the AI race against Communist China if Washington doesn't act fast, and added the consequences could be dire.
If we don't act now, and don't wake up right away and not in 5 to 10 years from now, unlike some of the Pentagon reports are saying, but if we don't take a stand now and take action, we have no fighting chance in succeeding 10 to 15 years from now.
So military AI is a big, burgeoning area. The Chinese have understood for a long time that command over AI gives an enormous advantage on the battlefield. One of the key aspects of this in terms of pattern recognition will be, for example, what we call facial recognition, of being able to identify, right, targets for anti-terrorist operations or for political assassination, identifying patterns that tell us about that military units are moving stealthily into a different region or are moving weapon systems from one area to another. That, again, picking up what seems like random data in order to identify those threats. It'll also speed up decision-making time in terms of what constitutes a real threat. For example, incoming missiles versus incoming commercial aircraft, in ways that a human observer will be able to identify, but an artificial intelligence-driven system will be able to identify far faster and probably more accurately than human observers can.
To watch today's full special report, click the link in the description down below. We're working with Epoch TV, and all special reports are published there in full length. A secret deal between Apple and Beijing. It's a $100 billion agreement to help the communist country develop its economy. In exchange, Beijing eased its crackdown on Apple's business operations in China and gave the tech giant some assistance.
The news of the deal came out from U.S.-based technology website The Information on Tuesday. The media outlet had done interviews with people familiar with the matter and viewed some internal Apple documents. Apple CEO Tim Cook signed the agreement in 2016 when he visited China, and it lasted 5 years. Back then, the company was dealing with a series of regulatory action in China. The report added Chinese officials believed Apple was not contributing enough to Chinese economy. As a result, Cook signed an investment agreement of $275 billion with a Chinese regime agency. It included building new Apple retail stores, research and development centers, and renewable energy projects. The deal didn't stop there. Apple also promised to help China build the most advanced manufacturing technologies. The CCP had an ambitious development plan called the 13th Five-Year Plan. Regarding the plan, Apple vowed to grow together with Chinese enterprises to achieve mutual benefits and a win-win situation. Internal documents viewed by The Information revealed that Apple also made compromises to Chinese authorities in other areas. In 2015, Chinese authorities demanded that Apple Maps make some islands in the East China Sea look big on the map. China and Japan have been in a dispute over who owns the islands. Chinese regulators threatened not to approve Apple Watch if the company doesn't comply. Apple followed the demand. Apple's App Store in China also looks different than the App Store in the U.S. and other countries. Tens of thousands of apps are missing, including apps of foreign news outlets and encrypted messaging services. Tools for organizing pro-democracy protests are blocked. Apple said it removed the apps in order to comply with Chinese laws. And what about data safety? Apple also appeared to comply with Chinese authorities in this area. According to a New York Times report, Apple is moving some of the personal data of Chinese customers to a data center in the Chinese city of Guiyang. And this data center is a state-owned company. Local authorities have direct access to the data stored there. In the years following the agreement, Apple has been very active in China. For example, the company signed a deal with China's largest wind turbine maker, which is located in Xinjiang, where ethnic Uyghurs face suppression by the communist regime. Apple also launched a $300 million investment fund for clean energy in China. The tech giant added 11 more retail stores and brought a Chinese manufacturer into iPhone 13 production. For Apple, China has turned into a cash cow. In a single year, the company made a record $68 billion in revenue in what it calls Greater China, which includes Hong Kong and Taiwan. And about 1/5 of Apple's total sales come from this region.
More countries are choosing not to send their officials to the Beijing Winter Olympics. This is what UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson told Parliament on Wednesday.
And there will be effectively a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. No ministers are expected to attend.
The U.S. announced on Monday a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics over China's human rights abuses. Officials would not attend the game, though American athletes are still able to compete. Canada was quick to act too. On Wednesday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also announced a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics.
As a country, indeed, as many partners around the world, we are extremely concerned by the repeated human rights violations by the Chinese government. That is why we are announcing today that we will not be sending any diplomatic representation to the Beijing Paralympic Games this winter.
Australia and New Zealand have already announced a diplomatic boycott earlier, and the European Union is still discussing the issue. The White House has confirmed a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics over what it calls the Chinese regime's egregious human rights abuses. Olympic boycotts have only happened 6 times in history, the first being the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne, Australia. Many countries withdrew for various political reasons. China was one of them because the Melbourne Olympics accepted Taiwan as an individual country. 8 years later, China boycotted the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. The move came in retaliation against the International Olympic Committee over its decision to disqualify some Chinese athletes from the Tokyo Games. The IOC cited the fact that China sent its top athletes to compete in Jakarta the year before, part of an emerging amateur competition. The third boycott on the list came in 1976 at the Olympic Games held in Montreal, Canada. Nearly 30 African countries declared a boycott of the Games, this time because of a sports embargo against South Africa. Taiwan also chose to abstain for another reason, because Canada refused to let it compete as a self-governed country. Next was Moscow in 1980. That large-scale boycott came in protest of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan the year before. Led by the U.S., 65 countries turned away from the Moscow Games. The Soviet Union boycotted the following Games, the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, in retaliation. 4 years later, the 1988 Olympics were held in Seoul, South Korea. But the event angered North Korea, as it wasn't allowed to co-host the Games. In response, its leaders refused to attend. Topping the list, the most notorious boycott dates back to the 1936 Berlin Olympics. At the time, Nazi leader Hitler used the Games for propaganda purposes. Drawing resources from nearly the entire country, he portrayed Germany as a friendly nation and masked the Nazis' persecution of the Jewish people. Just 3 years later, the Second World War began. And that's it for today's China in Focus. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.